Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Monday, May 18th, 2026. I'm Carlene Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. May 18th, if that doesn't jar your memory, if you maybe weren't here, 46 years ago today, the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So when I said that date, all of a sudden it struck me. I was here. I remember the sky went dark that day, and I think 57 people lost their lives. Pretty remarkable day in our state's history, and only 4 years now then till the 50th anniversary of the eruption. But I digress. Now, let's let you know what's coming up in today's episode of Washington in Focus. We have a new Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court Justice Theo Angeles was actually sworn in about 6 weeks ago, but today I was in Olympia for the ceremonial swearing in, and there was a packed courtroom for the Temple of Justice at the state Supreme Court. Me and my colleague TJ Martinell were among those inside that crowded courtroom today. Governor Ferguson was there, and that was one of the reasons we wanted to attend. I was hoping to have an opportunity to catch the governor, to ask about the income tax, to ask about daycare fraud, if his office has had any time to look into any of the things that we've been uncovering in recent months. I did not get an opportunity to speak with Governor Ferguson, but Senator Jamie Peterson, the author of the income tax, was there in attendance for the swearing-in ceremony. So you're going to see an exchange with him. He actually talked to me for 2 or 3 minutes on the record. I was pleasantly surprised he didn't try and dodge an interview. And so you're going to see that exclusively in today's episode. And then Americans for Prosperity, very concerned about the direction Washington is going. The new income tax on top of all the other sort of anti-business taxes that have piled on in recent years. The income tax, though, according to AFP, is the final straw for many. Same thing we've been hearing from the, business owners and wealthy folks that have given us interviews in recent weeks to say they're looking to relocate. They're looking to either move their business, their home, both out of the state of Washington. So interesting conversation with their Western Regional Director, Heather Andrews, in today's episode. And then finally, an update to a story we talked about a couple of days last week. This was the Professional Educator Standards Board meeting over a couple of days last week, and they were expected to take a vote on Friday to basically make it easier to remove a school superintendent deemed willfully non-compliant with not abiding by the rules from House Bill 1296, which basically undid the Parental Bill of Rights that had been passed a year before. So this was going to change basically, Washington administrative code to say, if you're if you're the superintendent of a district that has said we're not going to use the pronouns and we're not going to let the parents know what's going on with their kid at school, that this would make it easier to basically remove this elected superintendent. Well, the vote didn't happen Friday. So we're going to dive into that in today's episode. So Theo Angeles is Washington's newest state Supreme Court justice. Now, while he's already been on the job for about 6 weeks, he was sworn in hurriedly 6 weeks ago to begin, I guess they've got a lot on the agenda. But today in Olympia at the Temple of Justice building on the state capitol campus was the ceremonial swearing in, and the courtroom was packed with his family and friends, lots of his former colleagues from the law office where he has worked for the last several years. And then also lots of other former state Supreme Court justices were there. He's taken the seat of former Justice Barbara Madsen, who recently retired. She was there and received a lot of, accolades for her work on the bench. But that's who her exit, I should say, is why Theo Angeles was sworn in, appointed by Governor Bob Ferguson. And Governor Ferguson was there to make some very kind comments. I'll read you one of the things that he said. He said, anyone who's ever worked with Justice Angeles will say the same thing. For such a brilliant legal mind, he's also the nicest guy you will ever want to meet. And his wife was there, and his twins were there as he was sworn in. They zipped him into his ceremonial first robing. And again, as I mentioned, he is replacing Justice Barbara Madsen, who has retired. Now, I should tell you again, I mentioned in the opening, the reason why we went, because we could have just watched this ceremonial swearing in on TVW. We wanted to be there, my colleague TJ Martinell and I, because we knew the governor was going to be there, and hoped for an opportunity to get to speak with him about the recently passed income tax. Have not had a chance to see him personally and speak with him and ask questions about the income tax since the last day of session nearly 6 weeks ago. I was also hoping to ask him about some of the daycare center inexplicably large subsidy payments that we've been uncovering for months. Because on that last day of session, when I asked him about it, he said, I've been too busy with session. I'll get back to you. Haven't been able to get any further response from the governor's office about that. So I was hoping for an opportunity to say, hey, you've got the federal government going after blue states that aren't being, cooperative in investigating some of this, what appears to be, if not fraud, some questionably large payouts going out. Are you in fact cooperating with the federal government? And what have you done? What has your office done? I didn't get that chance to talk to him. But Senator Pedersen, the author of the income tax, I didn't know he was going to be there, but he was there. So when he walked out of the courtroom, we were ready to ask him some questions. And I got to give him some props because he didn't try and dodge or say that's not what today is about. We've seen that from some other politicians like Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson, who says, we're here to talk about this one single thing today, and you, reporter, can't ask me about anything else. He didn't do that. He stepped aside and granted me a short interview. And here is that conversation today with Senator Jamie Peterson. Center Square got a hold of in the income tax stuff. Any concerns about that affecting the case holding up when it gets to the court?
Nope.
Not at all? And any concerns about the, the coordination between you and the AG's office trying to circumvent the voters?
Okay. So
on the referendum.
Two things. Okay. Number one is absolutely normal for legislators to consult with the Attorney General's office on bills. I mean, I hope citizens would want their legislators to consult lawyers before they draft laws, right? That's a completely normal thing. Second thing, the court has now said what we said all along, which is the referendum power does not apply to tax measures, period. It doesn't matter whether we put language in there or not. The point that Noah Purcell was making to me was that it becomes easier for the Secretary of State if the legislature has made that explicit.
So originally, though, it seemed like the way the bill was drafted, it did not include anything about a referendum in there.
Because it didn't need to. It didn't need to. Because it's a tax measure, Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says it's not subject to referendum. It is, of course, subject to initiative, and that's what will happen now. But it is not subject to referendum. It doesn't matter whether we put that language in there. The only reason that that's important is because it signals to the Secretary of State what they should do. And without that, there would be potentially litigation about whether a referendum could be applied. But the court settled the question and said quite clearly that it doesn't apply because it's a tax measure.
Okay, and then what about as this thing is moving forward? You've got a lot of people, wealthy people, business people saying they're leaving. You saw the comments from former Governor Gregoire a couple of weeks ago at the AWB summit. People saying they're getting the heck out of Dodge. Are you concerned this isn't going to bring in the revenue that you hoped?
Time will tell.
So as you saw, Senator Peterson did not directly respond to my question when I brought up former Governor Gregoire's recent comments that, she says Washington government has a major spending problem, not a revenue issue, comparing her own, the size of government in the state budget when she left office versus what it is today. He didn't directly respond to that, basically just said, we'll see. At the end of the interview, you saw that. So, but again, props to Senator Peterson for being willing to step aside and at least respond to a couple of my questions. Now, as you know, if you've read any of our stories up at the Center Square Washington page or watched this podcast, we have spoken to many business owners and wealthy individuals who say it is the final straw for them. They are making plans to exit the state, take their business or shut down or sell their business, or at least relocate their personal residence to avoid the millionaire's tax, which again is 9.9% on income in excess of $1 million or combined household income in excess of $1 million. The income tax could be overturned by the people via initiative if, in fact, Let's Go Washington's measure makes it to the fall ballot. They have a short window of opportunity to be gathering signatures, out doing that now. There's also the legal challenge, of course, that's moving forward separately. So that brings us to item number 2 in today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. Americans for Prosperity is speaking out about Washington's increasingly what they call an anti-business climate and all the job creators talking about leaving, or maybe they've already left. For crying out loud, my colleague Randy Diamond is today writing up an article about Starbucks today announcing 250 more corporate positions being eliminated. So these aren't folks that are going to make the move to Nashville. These are folks whose jobs have been eliminated. AFP, I should tell you if you're not familiar with Americans for Prosperity, they are a libertarian, conservative political advocacy group. Easy for me to say. They promote, limited government, free market economics, lower taxation, lower cost of living, all those kinds of things that if you're watching this, you might be ascribed to some of those values for yourself. Maybe could use a little bit more of that around here. But I want you to see part of my conversation with Heather Andrews. She is the Western Regional Director for Americans for Prosperity.
There's so many people that are outraged because over, 100,000 individuals and taxpayers and residents signed in opposition, which was a record. And, lawmakers signed the bill anyway. To me, that's not leadership, that's defiance. And it's not a failure of democracy, but it's a failure to listen to it. When you have so many people who are not necessarily always engaged, but a record number sign in to voice opposition to something, yeah, and not to be taken seriously or listened to is, yeah, tragic. And I think this is, again, we're seeing what happened. They passed a record 9.4 billion in taxes last year in 2025, then added this 9.9% income tax in 2026. And the cumulative burden is now driving all of the people that are, the major contributors to the economy out of the state. It's accelerating the exodus. You're seeing, real business leaders leaving the state, from, photographers to, the best day spa to fintech companies to major tech companies. Just a wide variety of businesses are now saying enough is enough. I can't do this anymore. We can't afford it. And unfortunately, if you, look at history, this isn't going to just stop at millionaires. And that's what lawmakers are already admitting. This is going to hit everyone. And lawmakers are calling it a millionaire tax today, but ask them what the threshold will be in 10 years. And they've already, admitted, it'll drop. And so the foot is in the door, and history tells us exactly what's going to come next. With 1 in 4 Washington employers now actively considering leaving the state, which is nearly triple like the 8% rate from just like over a year ago, that's really scary. And people should be concerned. And state leaders should be concerned. The governor should be absolutely concerned. And especially Seattle. I mean, you're seeing incredible, like a lot of exodus of people leaving, fleeing Seattle, going to other parts of the state to just escape the high tax burden and the regulatory burden.
And a reminder, Let's Go Washington has begun their signature gathering effort with a lofty goal of obtaining, they hope to get maybe 400,000 signatures with 45 days left to get those. July 2nd is the deadline to get all those signatures. They only really need a little bit more than 300,000 valid signatures, but to account for, some are duplicates, some are folks that, aren't registered voters. They need to make sure that they get, way over the minimum to qualify so that they can account for any of those that get tossed out. So that effort's going on right now, as well as the lawsuit filed by Citizen Action Defense Fund, led by Jackson Maynard, and then the two sort of legal powerhouses that have aligned themselves with CATF's lawsuit, former Washington AG Rob McKenna and former Democratic Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge. So that's moving along on one path with a hope of, finding the income taxes unconstitutional at the same time that Let's Go Washington is moving ahead with their attempt to get a citizen initiative on the fall ballot. And now, in conclusion, I want to bring you an update to a story we reported on quite a bit last week. This is the Professional Educator Standards Board, and they were set to vote on Friday on new rules that would hold local school superintendents accountable for what they say is willful non-compliance with state laws. This is specifically regarding gender identity policies and parental notification policies that were spelled out when lawmakers, majority Democrats, passed House Bill 1296 in 2025. That required the Professional Educator Standards Board to go in and change the Washington Administrative Code to say that superintendents, whether they're certified or not, can in fact be removed if they're in a district that is not complying with these. So there have been several school boards across the state, Meade and Kennewick and LaCentre. We've reported on these over and over, where they've said, we don't want to go along with this. We believe it's in conflict with federal guidance. And in fact, it is. The state of Washington is under investigation by OSPI. The OSPI, yes, is being investigated by the federal government for the fact that we're in conflict, because I think it was his first day in office, or certainly the first week in office, that President Trump said, we're not doing this stuff. We're not doing the gender pronouns. We're not doing the boys and girls sports, all the things that, Washington State is still doing. And so the question is, why move forward on this now when there are lawsuits going on? And this, again, was passed in 2025. And here we are nearly halfway through 2026. And now you finally have this board saying, we're going to hold these superintendents accountable. Well, instead, on Friday, when they were expected to make this vote, they tabled the vote and said there was not sufficient time to consult with Washington's tribal community. Now, I don't know what the tribes said in their comments or reaching out to the PESB board and saying, we didn't have enough time to weigh in on this. You're not going to change, the Washington Administrative Code, basically Washington state law, without giving us more time. So they tabled it. There was no vote on Friday. Now, whether or not they're going to kind of slow walk this and wait for the courts to weigh in, or wait to see what the Trump administration does with their investigation into OSPI, that remains to be seen. We also don't know, but we intend to submit records requests to hopefully find out what the comments looked like that came into the PESB board, because Washington Policy Center's Education Center Director Vicki Murray and I don't think I saw it anywhere else, wrote about this extensively last week. And I think there was some pushback. Folks were submitting those comments, maybe showed up at their 2 days of meetings because those were open to the public. So I want to get a sense of how that might have played into things. So that is it for today's episode. of Washington in Focus Daily for this Monday, May the 18th. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again tomorrow.